Welcome, everyone. We are so excited that you're joining us today on this Wednesday, mid-apocalypse, as I've been saying, as some might say. I'm so excited to be here with you. My name is Brittany Ramos de Barros, and I'm a proud member of About Face Veterans Against the War, and so proud to be here to discuss the incredible recent events in Bolivia with some very knowledgeable and committed guests. So a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, you can post those in the comments. And we will, our guests will be able to see those and do our best to incorporate them into our answers. We're not going to do any direct Q&A, but this live stream will be recorded, and many of us will probably be able to circle back and answer comments in writing in the comments and things like that. And so just be patient and let's all enjoy this space to hear from folks that many of us don't get an opportunity to hear from enough here in the United States. So we are here to talk about, most importantly, the lessons that we who are committed to anti-imperialist struggle in the United States. And what do we mean by an anti-imperialist struggle? We mean the struggle against undue, unjust U.S. involvement, U.S. coercion, and U.S. exploitation of many different nations and lands around the world. And if you're not aware that that is a thing, then this is exactly where you should be, because you're going to learn about that today. But to learn about what those of us who are committed to that anti-imperialist struggle can learn from movements around the world, and today we're speaking about Bolivia in particular. So I am so honored to be able to introduce you to not one, but two segments in this live stream. So it's almost going to be two live streams for the price of one today. We're going to spend the first half speaking with some special guests that you see here with me on the screen, who will invite to introduce themselves in just a moment. And then we'll spend the second half speaking with some members of About Face, who will reflect on the lessons that they've shared and the lessons from their own experiences, both in the military and in Bolivia. And so it's going to be a longer than a usual live stream today. If you can't join the entire thing, that's okay. Remember that it will be recorded and it will live on the same social media platform that you're watching it. And so you can always come back. As we get started, we invite you to please share this live stream on your social media to help spread the word, because we know that this is a message and a topic that doesn't get enough attention and enough education. And so every little thing that you can do, I think, to help spread that awareness and that knowledge adds up. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests from the Chiapas Support Committee to introduce themselves and introduce that committee a little bit, and then we'll dig in. Who would like to start?
Myself in the committee. So my name is Inem. I am here in the Bay Area occupied Ohlone territory. I joined Chiapas Support Committee as a college student. It is a committee based in Los Angeles primarily, that was formed in 1995 in support of the Zapatista uprising in Mexico. And this is a transnational solidarity committee that is primarily in solidarity with African, Indigenous, and Campesino, like peasant struggles across the Americas. And most of our members are also people of African and Indigenous descent. And we basically educate students and organize around U.S. imperialism intervention across the Americas in resistance to this history of the Monroe Doctrine and various other forms of intervention. So I joined while I was in college, as I mentioned, and I had the opportunity to attend various delegations to different parts of Latin America. We do trips bringing in primarily African and Indigenous students to places like Honduras, Cuba, Mexico. Those are some of the ones that I participated in. And we've done trips to Bolivia, Venezuela. So a little bit more background on me. I am a Pan-Africanist organizer. I believe in the total liberation and unification of the African continent, and I believe that all of the struggles that are waged in the African diaspora are part of a singular struggle. That is, I view it within this framework. I believe in indigenous sovereignty, land back for indigenous people, indigenous autonomy, and resisting all forms of imperialism across the global south, and recognizing that as colonized people within the United States, that our liberation is directly tied to the liberation of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So that's a little bit of my background. I've also done some organizing work on the African continent in West Africa, connecting with organizers in Senegal, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. And I am here with the Chiapas Support Committee. I also do some organizing with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So that's primarily where I'm coming from, and my framework and my analysis. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We're so honored to have you. Thank you for being here. Tanalis, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Tanalis Padilla. Again, I'm also honored to be here, and also honored to speak alongside Inem and Cindy. I'm originally from Mexico, from rural Mexico, but my parents moved to the US, to California in the mid-'80s. And during that time, that was the height of U.S. intervention in Central America, the height of Washington's support for the vicious regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador, and the counterinsurgents, the counter-revolutionary movement in Nicaragua, which a popular revolution known as the Sandinistas had won there. And my parents, I was young, I was 12, 13, an adolescent, but my parents took me to the demonstrations against U.S. support for these regimes. And even though I didn't completely understand, it had an impact on me, especially because in many of these events, we heard from Central Americans, refugees who spoke and told their story of what they were suffering because of the U.S.'s intervention. So that had an early effect on me, and I went on to study. I was always very interested in guerrilla movements and revolutionary movements and anti-imperialist movements. And in college, as an undergrad, I took classes in Latin American history, which were the most inspiring, and it's the reason why I decided to become a historian myself. So I went to graduate school and did work in Latin American history. I did my graduate work in UC San Diego. So aside from studying the movements then in Mexico, I also participated with both cross-border organizing in San Diego and Tijuana, struggles that involved indigenous peoples there, or maquila workers there, and also in support of the Zapatista movement, the Zapatista uprising in 1994. I had already graduated from when the Chiapas Support Committee was formed, but I went on their first delegation in 1995 and been in a couple since. And my work as a historian, as a college professor, involves my teaching about Latin America and about anti-imperialist struggles and about poor people, Campesino, indigenous, and African movements for justice.
Amazing, amazing. It's such an honor to have you here with that background and the work that you're doing. Thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least, Cindy.
Just been such a privilege to watch the organizing of veterans against the U.S. empire. Such critical work. I share the philosophies, the sort of ground from which we organize, that Tanalis and Inem, who I'm just so honored to be with as well, set forth, and come from similar struggles, reaching back to the struggles against the wars in Southeast Asia that took so many millions of lives, and that probably veterans were in the United States the most conscious force organizing against. I was an organizer as a young person, a union organizer. I cleaned folks' houses, other people's houses. That led me into union work after being fired a number of times for doing union work without realizing that's what I was doing. And then ended up in the 1980s, spending about a year in Guatemala when it was at the height of its genocide. From an anti-imperialist stance, and since then have lived in or spent about 4 months a year in Latin America, mostly Guatemala, also Salvador, Chiapas. Privileged to be part of the work that Inem and Tanali spoke about. Became a journalist, couldn't make any money from that because left journalism, as you know, is unpaid. So I was drawn into being a teacher in adjunct professor. Then I got a tenure track job. Basically, it's just such a privilege being able to teach and also to gather the words of most of the work I do is oral histories. So Guatemalan guerrilla and Campesino, people in struggle, book published in Guatemala through university, National University, goes by the title of La Revolución Indígena y Campesina en Guatemala, and that's from 1970 to 2000. Joining the bulletins and pamphlets they produce, just like you folks are always doing such incredible work, like actually using that work as a historical archive together with their testimonies. And I thought since 2012, I've had the honor of going with some of the folks who gave me those testimonies from Guatemala, they're Mayan indigenous, to Bolivia, where there are 36 different indigenous peoples. And most of my time is in the Aymara and Quechua Andean highlands, which, everybody lives at about 12,000 feet, 13,000 feet. And just wanted to share quickly, in case I forget it later, that, so much of our information is censored, even though people are speaking loud and clear. And all around us. And, now I'm working on those quotes of people speaking to us from Bolivia on the blockades, on the barriers that they shut, over 100 barriers shutting the country down to move the dictatorship out of power. And at this point, I just want to mention that when the Aymara president of almost 14 years who was driven out by a coup last year that you mentioned, his name is Evo Morales Ayma, when he returned to Bolivia, a few days after that, he was interviewed on Telesur, which is English and Spanish. You can, fabulous place to get your information. And he said, we learned from him that there was an attempted coup a few days before the inauguration. And in that attempted coup, the generals were supposed to launch a second coup. First, one general stepped forward and said, I'm not going to participate in this because I'm with Mas. Then other generals stepped forward. So from within this gathering of generals, it might look like, and in truth, as in the police, people decided not to continue to take up arms against the majorities who were indigenous and, of course, working class. But if you look deeper, all those people were organized by the social movements. So they are the social movements, they're part of the social movements. And across the last few years, I've had the honor of spending a number of months. I was there 6 months this year and about 4 months last year, a lot of it through the coup. And people are always telling me, don't worry, we're organizing. They would actually give me more detail than that, right? And I was sort of astounded, but it was, again, it's just such an honor to, be here to talk with you about these things and hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. One insight already that jumps out, I think, from that commentary is just the difference about the ways that social movements are structured, often in the global South and the way that they're structured in the United States. And I think even just with the recent election in the United States, I know I, as an organizer, saw a real gap and tension in the way that we think about electoral organizing versus social movement organizing, right? And that structure is very different in Latin America. And I think that that's coming out already in the way that you're, sharing about how, those folks took that stand in an elected or government position because they were organized in part of these social movements and parties. Yeah, the other thing is that I didn't say this at the beginning, but for those who know me, my job in the military is that I was a trained propagandist. And psychological operations has been one of the ways that the narrative has been shaped, right? Even across the global South, there's a lot of damage that has been done by misinformation and psychological operation campaigns to manipulate people to believe things that are not necessarily true, et cetera. And one of the ways that happens is ahistoricism. In the United States, there's a huge gap in our understanding about our own nation's history, let alone what our nation has been doing around the world. And so I want to start with a little bit of grounding in what is the recent relevant history of Bolivia. And obviously we only have a few minutes to talk about that. And so, I invite people to continue to study. But we're going to go, as Tanalise mentioned, she's a historian. And so we have the benefit of hearing from her, both from that study and also personal experience, of a little bit about, break it down for us, Tanalise, for someone who knows nothing about Bolivia, right? Other than that it's a country in South America. What is happening that is relevant? Why are we talking about this right now? And I'll preview a little bit and say, the title of this episode is Bolivia Rejects the Coup. And so if you weren't aware, there was a US-backed coup in Bolivia. We have evidence that it was US greenlit at a minimum, right? If not actively backed. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read our statement that I'm about to post in the comments from 2019 condemning that US-backed coup. And then, yes, tell us a little bit about the history that we need to know to understand what's happening.
Great, thank you. And it's a really rich history to which I can do no justice to, but especially and very briefly. But I will do my best. So Evo Morales was indeed elected in 2005 as a member of the MAS, the movement towards socialism, which, as Cindy and Brittany already said, is a movement. Began as a movement and more than a party. And so Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president in a country that is between 40 and 60% indigenous, was hugely significant because since the conquest, it had basically been ruled by a white oligarchy, a white minority, and then their descendants. And he was also elected by percentages never seen before, 55% of the population, and then re-elected by even higher margins. So when he became president in 2006, it was as momentous as as the fall of apartheid in South Africa, and yet we saw no coverage of that. Basically, no coverage in the U.S. And during his 14 years in office, they had a profound effect on rising people out of poverty. Just go over some very brief statistics that speak to this. He was able to reduce poverty rates by over 40% and reduce extreme poverty rates by 60%. Then in a country that was among the poorest in the hemisphere. And he did this, or his party did this, and his program through funding the expansion of healthcare, of education, of pensions, and boosting the minimum wage. Another important thing to know about, the time that his party and that he was in office was, Bolivia had an extreme concentration of land in which 400 families owned 70% of the land, and his party issued titles to over 900,000 land grants to people without land. And his administration nationalized the hydrocarbon industry. So meaning these industries that are typically coveted by international or transnational corporations and extract the profits, nationalizing them keeps the profits in the country to fund these social programs. And even by World Bank standards and the IMF, who were against all this type of policy, Bolivia was doing well. So not only in reducing poverty, but in economic growth. In 2019, Evo was running for his fourth term, and he was still immensely popular. And when the right wing was clear that he might very well win again without a second round, they began to call fraud, that the allegations of fraud, even before the elections even happened. They were already saying, if he wins, it'll be by fraud. That should sound familiar to us in the US. And in Bolivia, to avoid a runoff, you have to win by 10 points over the next candidate. And as the results of the 2019 election were coming in, Evo was just about that, hovering about that, not quite at over, and then eventually caught up, which makes total sense because the votes from the rural areas where the MAS has its strongest support come in later and are counted later. It's slower to come in. And so once all the votes were counted, he was indeed at above 10% points, 10 points above the next candidate. And so he was declared the winner. And yet the opposition, the right, neoliberals had been stoking the fear, stoking the allegations of fraud and began basically mounting violent campaigns in which they attacked the family members of Evo Morales himself, of other MAS leaders, and kidnapped. Some indigenous people were attacked on the streets by these civic committees, and basically it was forced to resign. It was reported in the Western media, and the mainstream media, that he was suggested to resign. But if we want to be honest, in terms of to avoid violence, not to mention the actual violence of his family members, he was forced to resign, and he fled to Mexico and later Argentina. The regime that came to power after that, Janine Áñez, a little-known senator whose party received about 4% of the vote, declared herself and was declared president in something that violated the line of secession. And she herself had already spewed racist views against indigenous people, calling them satanic. Other members of the right opposition, declared that the Bible had finally been replaced in the palace, is an implicit rejection of indigenous, of the indigenous empowerment that the Evo administration saw. And to stay in power, Janine Áñez unleashed a horrible repression in which, and is responsible basically for two massacres. She declared that the armed forces could, kill with immunity, and so they did. Over 20 people were killed, over 200 injured in what are known as the Sacaba and the Sencata massacres. She was supposed to just be a transitional government that would oversee elections, and yet she didn't. She postponed them basically 4 times, and then ran herself as a candidate. Eventually, towards the end, ended up dropping out because she had so little support, and also as a hope to unite the right. And her administration, which lasted almost a year, saw immense corruption, saw an attempt to reverse the spectacular gains of the Evo and the MAS administration. and saw various racist attacks against the indigenous population. So, and also tried to discredit the candidates running for the MAS in the elections that, as Cindy has mentioned, probably more about. She was finally forced to hold elections by popular mobilizations, and in these elections, the MAS candidate Luis Arce won by a landslide victory of 55%, more than 25%, rather 25 points over the next candidate, the neoliberal right-wing Carlos Mesa, and so. That's sort of, kind of a really brief outline, and I look forward to both Inem and Cindy can speak more about the popular movements between this, and I also look forward to speaking about any more details about this since I went over it rather quickly.
Yes, I know. Like you said, it's not enough time to do justice, but I take comfort. First of all, that was the best brief summary I think I've heard. So thank you so much for that history. Some folks are commenting that in the comments as well. Yeah, and there's just so many parallels. My mind is just like exploding with like connections already. So thank you for that. One of the things I think is really important to highlight, as for me, as I've been learning more and more about Latin American movements, there's this, I think, conditioned American tendency to be like, there's too many factions and like, and you just kind of shut down and like don't really dig into it. And so I wonder if one of you could tell us a little bit, kind of break it down for us. Who are the different players in the landscape of Bolivia? And Tanalis, kind of build on what Tanalis already mentioned about those players, but just kind of highlight for us, like the MAS party we heard about and movement is one, right? And kind of like the role that they're playing. And then, what are the other players in the field there in Bolivia right now that are relevant? Inem, do you feel like, or Cindy? Yeah, great. Oh, Cindy, let's unmute you. Okay, there you go.
Maybe I can talk about some of the players, and then Inem has information on the struggle of Afro-Bolivian Coca union leader, 35,000 people in that union that the Chiapas committee was able to intersect with that struggle. So the MAS party comes out of just this incredibly anti-imperialist, vast number of distinct local organizing struggles. So what I just said defines the coca growers, of whom Evo Morales is emerged as their leader, but he's always saying correctly that he follows the orders of the women. So the women run the show. In the Cocaleros Union, it's a country where, because of the 5,000 years of indigenous history, people do their assemblies very intensely. And they've been able to drive out neoliberal presidents in the past. In 2003, they drove out somebody who was very dear to the United States, who was trying to sell off vast natural gas resources. They drove him into exile to the United States, organizing house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community. So that describes the larger reality. You'll often hear, if you're listening to people talking from the streets when they're protesting, or when they're carrying their the coffins of their relatives after these massacres and being tear gassed and brutalized. You'll hear that they say, we're not MAS, and what they're saying is, we've actually been around for the entire colonial era resisting this. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Everybody who's in the streets, and a good portion of the middle class, is votes for MAS. However, It was formed in the mid-90s, 95, as a political instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples. That's actually part of its name, MAS, IPSP. Joining the Cocaleros, joining the ancient communities of the highlands, which are Quechua and Aymara, organized. Just to take it geographically, if you move up from the subtropics of the Cocaleros, you come to the city of Cochabamba, which kept the transnationals from privatizing their water in the water wars of 1999, 2000. So they're intensely organized. That actually came out of Quechua women who have managed the irrigation channels in the fields for since Inca times, when they arrived there as colonists of the Inca speaking Quechua. So that's often called an urban movement. One curious thing in answer to your question about Bolivia is the urban-rural divide is fascinating, complicated. A lot of people in the cities actually are also campesinos. They go back and forth. So there's tremendous unity. If you move from Cochabamba, which is around 8,000 feet, the actual city, up to the Andes, which are 12,000, 13,000 feet, you have communities organizing in the place where most of Spain's mining wealth came, which was, it's called Potosi, and it created vast silver wealth and vast tin wealth. And it's always been strongly collectively indigenous. If you move toward Peru, probably one of the sort of most fiercely, effectively organized groupings are the Aymara indigenous. They actually, their authorities wear red ponchos, so they're called the ponchos rojos. They, in response to the paramilitaries of the right wing, which were their main fighting force before the Áñez coup regime, military and police joined them. These paramilitaries had been around for a number of years and became an enormous phenomena in 2019, actually starting in 2018. And they're often on motorcycles charging into demonstrations of women, charging into, they kill people, they set ballots on fire, yelling racist slogans. So like recently after the elections, they were all jumping up and down in their demonstrations saying, if you're not jumping, you're invective, racist word for the indigenous. But the Aymara of the highlands, the Ponchos Rojos, gathered together hundreds of motorcycles to peacefully respond to their motorcycles and protect the blockades. They were a significant, critical part of bringing down the neoliberal government and became a critical part of MAS. So the national campesino unions or peasant unions have different regional groupings, and they're one of them. The miners, for those of you who know Bolivia, you know that it has one of the strongest union movements in the hemisphere. And those miners, tens of thousands of them joined the blockades in August, and likewise have been acting across the 20th century at critical junctures. They're the protagonists, the miners and the campesinos of Bolivian history, and always have been, across two very racist centuries of Republican rule. The campesinos, and especially the Aymara campesinos and the Ponchos Rojos, have actually been organizing militarily. There's an automatic draft of the poor and indigenous and working class. So everybody has the military training. They put that to good use and organize from one end of the country to the other. And hence, also part of how they were organizing within the military. And the police. So I kind of speak like people do in the testimonies I gather, which is in circles rather than in outlines. Geographically, it's like each place has an incredible identity that's come together to join in these movements. And the lowlands are Amazonian and also dry scrubland. And likewise, strong indigenous organizing and working class people who've moved to this city of Santa Cruz.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's an amazing way to lay out, I think, some of the different groups. Thank you for that, Cindy. And I appreciate the way that you incorporated kind of a geographic sense of the country as well, because I think a lot of us are not well educated in kind of like what are the regions of a place like Bolivia and what is the geography like in relationship to how that shapes political organizing. Inem, I'd love to hear from you if you have anything to add about that, and then also bridge to kind of another question, which is, what do you think are the most important lessons that we who are organizing here in the United States, the belly of the beast, as many say, can take from what is, from recent events, from Bolivian movements? What do you think are the most important things that we need to incorporate?
Absolutely. So I can touch on both. So one of the things, the primary thing that I've been working on with Chiapas Support Committee since the coup, or a little bit post the coup, is the struggle to free the political prisoner Elena Flores. She is an Afro-Bolivian woman, a union leader. She heads ADEPCOCA, the Departmental Association of Coca Farmers, a 35,000 member strong union. And she was incarcerated, held as a political prisoner by the racist, misogynist, anti-labor Janine Áñez regime post the coup. So to give, am I frozen?
You're good.
Am I good? Did I cut off? Okay. So to give a little bit of background, she was elected the president of this union in late July of 2019, a few months before the coup, and that itself was a struggle because the previous administration of the union was very corrupt. They were working with the paramilitary. They were really aligned with the right. They were enriching themselves off of union dues. It was a struggle to even get them to hold elections. So this was a big deal. And this is somebody that was, Elena Flores was somebody that was really trying to dismantle the narco politics of the region and to really build up campesino power, rural power. As somebody coming from this like Yungas region, this really Afro-Bolivian region of the country. Just a few months after the coup happened, this is like early this year in March in 2020, she is incarcerated and held as a political prisoner. They claim that she trespassed on a hospital. This is actually a hospital that was owned by the union. And for 8 months, up until really just late last month, she was detained in the middle of this global pandemic during a time when Bolivia, under the coup, was also rolling back a lot of the gains of the MAS party, including things in healthcare. So probably like the worst time ever to be a prisoner in Bolivia. I mean, there's a coup and there's a pandemic, and she was just released thanks to the fact that MAS has been brought back into power. She was able to return home. But I share this because I think that there's a lot of similarities between our struggles here in the US and the struggles across the Americas. And I don't think that we're often encouraged to make those connections. And I think, that is something that's very intentionally obscured. They make it seem like, mainstream media makes it seem like Latin America is so complex, we can't possibly understand it. We can't understand US intervention. But honestly, across the hemisphere, there's a profoundly similar history of shared indigenous and African struggle. This entire hemisphere since 1492 has, beginning in 1492 in some regions, and during that next century was marked by genocide against indigenous peoples, and then beginning of enslavement of African peoples. These are things in the United States that we are familiar with and we can relate to. The only major difference is that within Latin America, African and indigenous people have an additional struggle of also trying to resist an external power as well. So there's an internal struggle that indigenous and African and working class campesino peasant people are waging, but there's also an external one with imperialism intervention, and that's where the difference comes in, that it's kind of more twofold, but that should compel us even more as people within the United States who do have an understanding of the history of settler colonialism, to start to understand, how does the United States ally with racist regimes, with anti-labor regimes in other countries. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can take away from the Bolivian struggle and just struggles across the Americas in general.
Yeah, that is so well put. Yeah, I've never thought about it that way, that it is, I've thought about it that we don't make the connections across our struggles, but I've never thought about it is literally the same struggle, but with imperialism layered on top, right? That's such a good way to put it. It's such a simple way to understand it, and it's true. One of the things we say in About Face a lot is that, a lot of us realize that so many people in the United States we're taught to feel shame about being poor, right? Because we have this bootstrapping narrative that all of us can become millionaires and billionaires, that kind of keeps us from realizing that we're all part of this working class, right? That is also being used and exploited by the same oligarchy, right? The same few wealthy corporations and individuals who are also exploiting and exporting that exploitation and importing what they exploit across Africa, Latin America, right? So many regions, and that because of that, many of us have more in common, right, with the Campesino movements and the people doing movements like that in Bolivia than we do with the people, people like Jeff Bezos or even politicians, right? Many of the politicians who get elected here, who we have kind of weird ways of identifying with. Yeah, so I just want to open it up. We're going to wrap up in just a couple minutes. So we just have a couple minutes left for this, but and move to our next conversation, our next segment. This has been so incredible. I'm just wondering if there are any other kind of practical takeaways that you all think that folks in the United States need to know about this situation, or that movement people especially can learn from the recent successes and growing success of indigenous anti-imperialist Bolivian movement. Sure, go ahead, Cindy.
Maybe just to point out a few things about the recent struggles. The overturning of the coup regime was facing repeated postponements of the elections that Tanalis mentioned. Well, the coup regime tried to criminalize and destroy the MAS party. It was always the social movements taking the streets that prevented that from happening, and most powerfully in August. And in those August barricades that were put up across the country, those were also assemblies where what was being done was decided by the people, like thousands of people at these assemblies. So they actually called a general strike in advance of their leadership. Their leadership is now folded into the MAS party at very high levels, at the highest levels. Just want to point that out, and it's often women taking that initiative. At a certain point, they're actually calling for the resignation of the president based on the assemblies, but then decided that that would open too much of a door to the imperialist-backed forces within the military. When the vote, landslide vote happened, was that October 18th, almost immediately the paramilitaries, who are organized youth, similar to other, Nicaragua, Venezuela, you see these phenomena that are called civic committees or university students. In the United States mainstream media, they're actually trained paramilitaries, and they camped out in front of police stations and army bases, demanding that the army create a second coup, that they pull off another coup. They spent the whole year insisting that it wasn't a coup, that it was civilians bringing down a dictatorship of the indigenous, of Evo Morales. I guess one other piece that I'm not, so they reveal themselves, right? The problem is where to get the information on what they're saying. I would say Telesur. You can find that in English, Resumen Latinoamericano in the Third World. You can find that in English. A lot of video, people talking directly to us, right? It's just most folks don't know how to get there. And they say things with regard to organizing. There's a different strategy in each region. So in one region, they organize like ants, the insect, that appear alone by day and come together at night. In the Yungas, they organize like a particular bird that dives and attacks where coca grows, so they all acted like that bird. In other areas, they organized on the model of a mass of fleas, like in your blankets, fleas, just a huge mass of fleas, right? So like these organizing strategies emerging out of local culture realities would be another way to think of that.
Wow, thank you. Inem, anything that you would like to add before we wrap up?
I guess I'll briefly say that I also think that MOS as a whole serves as a model for us in the United States. I think a lot of people wonder, why our sort of presidential options, our electoral options are so out of line with the interests and the desires of the people. And then there's kind of an idea of, well, maybe we just need to vote the right people in. But I think Bolivia also serves as an excellent model as a movement that really built, from the ground up. It was based in mass struggle from the beginning, campesino struggle, working class struggle, housewives participating in building MOS from the ground up. And I think that really is something that we can learn from here in the US. And they were able to achieve political power that way. And things might look different in different places, different contexts, and different countries, but I still think it's something to learn about and to study, how did they do it, and just think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's right. And Tanalise, anything that you would add?
So much has already been said. I have little to add, and just in terms of time, I know we don't have a lot. So I'll just say really briefly is that it's for us who live in the U.S. in the belly of the beast. It's a two-pronged struggle and strategy. One is to obviously inform ourselves, because we're probably among the most ignorant of what is not only what's the history of our own country, but the history of Latin America and the history of the U.S.'s intervention and deeply violent imperial history in that region. So learning and studying that and learning that from the perspective of the South. And that's only going to happen, or it's only going to be productive if you're also involved in organizing at the same time, because so much of the knowledge comes in the process of struggle. And so that education through struggle is so important if we wish to change not only our own reality, but that of our brothers and sisters around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly for folks who might not think about the distinction, right? Organizing, I think one of the lessons from MOS is organizing not just around issues, right, in silos, and only doing mobilizations, although certainly those are an important component, but building real organization, right, where you're building shared analysis, shared vision, and taking shared action for the long run over what really is a multi-decade strategy, right? We talked about how really the movement that we're talking about in Bolivia is, you could say hundreds of years old. And we often are very short-sighted in the way that we get caught up very intentionally, right? That's by design. These 2 to 4 year cycles, we get caught up in these advocacy cycles. And there are ways that we have to for harm reduction. And yet I think that all of this has demonstrated the power of building organization and really building unity of the working class with deep analysis, with deep understanding of the way that power flows through structure, through identity, through all of these different things in the belly of the beast here is going to be really important for us to have the international revolution that we really need, right, in order to undo all of this. So without any further ado, we will start to shift to move to our next segment. Thank you to the Chiapas Support Committee and to you all, Cindy, Tanalise, and Inem, for sharing your experience, your brilliance. I don't know if it was mentioned, so I just want to foot stomp that Tanalise and Cindy were actually on a delegation to be observers of the election. They got to be there on the ground. So what they're sharing is rooted in both study and experience. And Inem does incredible solidarity organizing, as she mentioned in the beginning, with movements in Bolivia. And so if you're interested in getting involved, which many of us should be, then you please check out their website, support their work, contribute. You know, anyone who does movement organizing knows that all of this is a labor of love, and yet we need resources in order to be able to sustain ourselves. And those are often grassroots resources for this kind of anti-imperial work, because shocker, corporate nonprofits are not too eager to support work that is trying to undo their power. And so, it's so important that we support the work of the important internationalist organizing like this, because again, that's what it's going to take. So I just cannot thank you all enough for joining us today. We will be in touch to continue to build our relationship together and be in struggle together. And just know that you have our support and solidarity at About Face, and we just really admire the work that you are building and doing. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. Such an honor.
Thank you so much for having me and all of us.
Absolutely. Okay. Wow, we are just on a marathon of learning, to sound cheesy, as I often do. We are now going to move to a second conversation, a second segment, where we're going to spend another 45 minutes to an hour, if we can make it, to talk through some reflections on with my colleagues at About Face. And so I am so excited to welcome them both to the screen. Welcome, Tati and Giovanni. I want to give credit where credit is due. Giovanni has long been an advocate for internationalist organizing within About Face and a teacher to many of us, including me, about Latin American struggle, and was really the engine behind making sure that we took the time to reflect on this and to learn and share that learning. And so I want to thank you, Giovanni, for organizing us to do this. It's so powerful. I can see people in the comments, agreeing and really appreciating the learning. Yeah, and so let's just do another round of introductions for folks who might be joining now. Oh, we lost Todd. I'm sure he'll be back in just a moment. Internet struggles in the time of COVID. Here we all are. But my name is Brittany Ramos de Barros. I'm a proud member of About Face Veterans Against the War. We are a national organization of post 9/11 military veterans who do anti-imperialist organizing. And if you're not sure what anti-imperialism is, don't worry. It's actually on its face pretty easy to understand. Anti-imperialism is our work to stop the U.S. intervention, exploitation, etc., of not just indigenous, Afro descent, etc., people, working class peoples here on Turtle Island, on the U.S. in the U.S., but also around the world, which we often know too little about. And so, if you weren't aware that that was something that we were doing, it is. We do so much meddling around the world in really violent and horrifying ways, and we often get that we're told the story, right? That it's because we're supporting the good guys against these kind of cartoonish, evil people who are trying to become dictators or oppress the people. And yet, if you were here for our last segment, then you heard about how actually often it's the people who get put into power through U.S. intervention and through U.S. actions who are exactly those kinds of violent dictators who then the people have to rise up to oppose. So with that bridge and framing, I'd love to invite you all to introduce yourselves. for this next round of the conversation.
Hey, how you guys doing? Thank you, Brittany. Todd, thank you for coming. So I'm with Brittany. I'm facilitating with Brittany. So the starter show here is Todd. So we're so Todd's gonna be on the light, under the light, and Brittany and I will be shooting questions his way, you know. So I'm Giovanni, also a member of About Face, a veteran, 14 years Army veteran. Been a member of About Face since 2013. Been a member of the staff since 2016. I'm a member coordinator. And without further ado, Brittany, you want to start with grilling Todd?
Sure. Well, let's give Todd a chance.
Okay, go ahead.
Todd, introduce yourself before we put you in the hot seat.
Hi, everyone. Todd Arena. You can call me Toddy, he, him. I'm a member of About Face for a couple of years now. I think I joined in 2018, I want to say. I was my veteranness. I served in the early 2000s. Through my contract, my reserve contract ended in 2009. I was called to active duty for Operation Enduring Freedom, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. I didn't go overseas. I was mobilized to do I was with the medical unit, so did sort of mob and demob and backfill for at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which, interesting, since we're talking so much about settler colonialism and occupation, just a little history of Fort Sill. It was actually the end of the Trail of Tears, and Geronimo's grave is actually still on that military installation because it was federal land when it was a concentration camp for indigenous people, displaced indigenous people. His grave is still there. And now the land is used as target practice for artillerymen, and that's sort of, some context there. And so I only spent like a year of active duty for the Iraq invasion, in 2004. And so, soon after that, I went to law school and had the opportunity to take sabbatical. And I was sort of, had not yet fully sort of, was still sort of trying to, it was a radicalizing experience for me, being called up and start sort of learning in a crash course way all of the complex history of the U.S. as a settler colonial nation, through being on that land, as well as learning more and more about what was going on over in the Middle East and the history there, and the deeper histories, and the more sort of the layers of the onion you pull, the more it was disorienting to me, and realizing that I had no idea what I had signed up for when I first signed up, just to pay for college. And so, I had the opportunity to take a sabbatical year, and I'd been hearing a lot of this stuff, Cindy and especially was saying how there's so little information that we get here in the US about other places in the world. But I had heard a little bit of stuff through social justice and leftist media, which you sort of can find trickles of about what was going on in Bolivia. By the time I had the opportunity in 2006, the Moss had come to power in 2005, and similar to Venezuela, for example, and other places, there's a very polarized discourse. And so I was hearing just even on basic facts. And so part of me was well, I'm hearing that they're evil. And then I'm hearing people are no, actually this is really good stuff, but not a lot of in between. And so I was sort of you know what, that's where I want to go spend my sabbatical year. And, I can justify it as Spanish immersion, but really it was so I could go see for my own eyes and learn for myself what the truth was. And I just had like a really amazing and transformative, life-changing experience being in that country. What I did there, you know, I'd had some, you know, background in my life with sort of like working with economic development. So I volunteered with a microfinance group in El Alto, which is a sort of an indigenous town that surrounds the country's capital, La Paz, sort of you know, an autonomous Aymara, you know, modern settlement, but also practices the IU, you know, like the sort of indigenous traditional governance. So it's sort of this interesting like way of seeing like, you know, modern development and modern living, but like, you know, done through, not through a Western individualist model of society, but through, you know, sort of like a communitarian collective, you know, model of society. And it was a very, you know, transformative experience. And the other experience that I had, you know, when I was there was working with a local human rights law firm, Rogelio Maita law office. And what I was helping them with was they were extraditing, Cindy mentioned the president who, through the gas, selling off of the natural gas to US corporations, and was thrown out of power, and the gas war, as they called it in the country, really a massacre, like a several-day massacre, where tanks, helicopters, and heavily armed, you know, modern riot gear military police faced off against indigenous with like, you know, rifle stocks, and you know, and sticks and stones for several days. And so we were trying to extradite him from the United States. And so that's sort of my, you know, context for being in Bolivia.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that and for sharing with us your experience. You know, I think that brings us to kind of almost circling back a little bit. So Giovanni, you know, I know last year you helped to initiate About Face putting out a statement condemning the coup in Bolivia. And, you know, I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about why you felt that was important at that time. And yeah, even maybe share a little excerpt from the statement. For anyone who's just joining us, you should see a link to that statement in the comments if you're curious. And there's also several links to articles for you to learn more about the background at the bottom. Yeah, if this is a, you know, a teaser and you're interested to learn more.
Yeah, so so the article should be down in the description of this this live stream. So and I implore you to check it out. I'm not going to read it, but just one area that they're very interested in the article is that is a teaser, is pretty much the U.S. role behind it, and the U.S. embassy behind the what happened in November 2019 with the ouster of Morales. So yeah, so if you guys have a chance to look at it, you know, there's an audio clip on it where it implicates a couple of legislators to the coup as well. So it's a teaser. So you get a chance, go down there, check read the article, click on the hyperlink, you know, and you'll find out what I'm talking about. It's in Spanish though, but
there's both.
Yeah, there's both. Okay, yeah. So yeah, so Todd, so I want to hit you up with this little synopsis here, right, of what went down in Bolivia last year in 2019. So you have Evo Morales, you have the Mass Party. The Mass Party means Movimiento hacia Socialismo, which means moving towards socialism, right? So Evo Morales became the first indigenous head of state in Bolivia, which Bolivia is, if you guys don't know, Bolivia is a majority indigenous country. Evo Morales just became the first head of state in Bolivia, came to power in 2006. He came to power in a wave of what was called back then, early 2000s, the pink tide. which pink tie meant it was a movement of Latin American countries with the left to center left leaning governments, coming to power, who resisted U.S. influence and coercion, and instead asserted their sovereignty and independence while showing solidarity with each other and seeking integration with each other. Right. So Bolivia, for as long as I can remember, was always considered the second most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere. Second to Haiti, but under the Mas government, under Evo Morales, Bolivia went through gained a lot of strides. Right, economically became the fastest growing economic country in South America, etc. Right. So he was ousted in a violent coup in November 2019, by a coalition of liberal and right-wing forces comprised of fascist militias, ultra-conservative evangelicals, anti-indigenous sectors, the military, and the police, with the active support of the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and the Organization of the American States. Evo was able to flee with his life. There was a mob actually looking for him. They ransacked his home, they threatened his family, and there was actually a mob looking for him. But he was able to flee with his life because he took refuge in the Mexican embassy, which was able to fly him out of the country. Meanwhile, there was a lot of violence towards mass officials and supporters. There were purges, jail, people getting beaten up, people even killed. There was a massacre you heard earlier. And there was a right-wing dictatorship that was installed, bent on undoing everything Morales did in the last several years while he was in power. Elections were forced upon the de facto government. The de facto government conceded to the mass mobilizations, right? And the elections were held in October 18, where the mass had a stunning victory, landslide. Pretty much the opposition had a crushing defeat. And the mass came back to power. President Luis Arce was inaugurated as the president of Bolivia in November 6th. I believe he's also indigenous as himself. And the story, happy ending. Am I accurate with this, or there's more to it?
I mean that's broadly accurate. Obviously we can. There's, everything is more complex than a summary, but I think that's right. I think you highlighted the points that I thought that stuck out to me as the most pertinent over the past year, which is that there was. In the last portion, Brittany was highlighting sort of like the compare and contrast about electoralism and social movement, and how here in the U.S. we sort of treat them as very separate and ne'er the twain shall meet sort of thing. But with the MAS and the social movements in the Bolivian street, sort of demonstrated is that if you want to succeed at the electoral box in a crushing way, it needs to be sort of a both and that, like, by showing up and supporting and organizing, both in support of communities that were, out protesting for protective equipment that was not being provided in the midst of a pandemic, a lack of food distribution in the midst of a pandemic while also having shutdown orders. So just like complete mismanagement of the crisis. While at the same time stripping civil and political rights. Groups were showing up to demand the election actually go forward. They were trying to say, oh, we can't have an election in a pandemic here, even though they were supposed to have the election like in May originally, if not, before that. So it's like, if you had just done it on time, maybe we wouldn't have had to do it in the midst of a pandemic. And then amidst all the repression as well, and sort of supporting the different communities that are confronting, in direct struggle, all of these issues, some of which are also facing daily violence. You know, if you go down to Santa Cruz and talk about Plan 3000 or something like that, Plan 3000, which is in you know, a sort of informal community, informal settlement that's pretty large of you know, indigenous and campesino from various parts of the country outside of Santa Cruz, which is a big commercial and economic center. So a lot of jobs are there. So they live in this community, and you see like the civic committee youth that Cindy mentioned, that sort of you know, have a lot of you know, Christian supremacist, if not outright fascist symbolism and tactics, using the motorcycle gangs. Those groups were actively like attacking Plan 3000 just constantly because of, you know, this sort of scapegoatism and you know, this feeling of triumphalism that they had taken the country back from the indigenous. And so, you know, the social movements that form MOS are active, involved in all of these, and sharing resources and supporting people in these frontline struggles all across the country at the same time. What does that do, you know, other than drive support for saying like, these people actually do have our backs. So it's worth it for us not just to like show up to vote, to like teach the, you know, the far right a lesson, but because we actually think that these people will be there for us. And I think that's sort of the both and view of like social movements and electoralism that the MOS had is something that, you know, the last panel talked a lot about lessons we can learn. I think that's one of the main lessons we can learn is starting to understand that if you view things as a unified, you know, different tactics for a unified struggle, for unified strategy, that can be, you know, transformative in a way that sort of silos doesn't really get you there. And it, you know, unless you have like a quick follow-up question, I think the other piece that I wanted to highlight is, you know, even if you just look at the pure electoralism element, you know, one of the things that was so inspiring, you know, was seeing, you know, like images shared over social media of like, you know, the MOS, IPSP, you know, in the lead up to the election, you know, trying to do as much social distancing with PPE as possible, always outdoors. You know, it's you know, we're sort of going into fall and winter there in the southern cone, so it's like for them it's like moving into spring and summer. So it was easier to do this in October and but like what they would do is they literally, like, similar to you know, what you had seen in South America in the 20th century in early democratic socialist models of political organizing, like you saw in Chile, that Salvador Allende did. The lead up to the election, it was not just like a, you know, the election is the election. This is an opportunity for us to go take a tour of the country and listen to demands, go village by village, town by town, city by city, region by region, and just activate your base in every single corner of it, and revitalize the party as an instrument, as a tool of the social movements, rather than just like, oh, if you don't vote for us, you're, you know, like, you're complicit or something. It was like really recognizing that if we want these votes, we need to go out there and we need to meet people where they're at and start activating them. And I think those are really inspirational things that, you know, for so many ways that we here in the U.S. could sort of learn from.
Yeah, I like what you said there about using. See, here in the United States, what I've seen is, what I notice is like the either this or that type of attitude. Either you're involved with electoral politics, you do, or you're not involved with electoral politics. You're involved with, you know, I guess street organizing, right? It's like this or that type of thing, you know. But like you said, how they wed everything together, and how they see electoral politics. They see electoral politics as a tool, not the be all end all of politics. Is actually a tool, and organizing, just like the panelists before us highlight it is like ongoing. It never stops. It just keeps going, never stops, because the moment you sleep, you know, that's the moment where everything that you work for is taken away from you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that, you know, I think that what inspires me about Latin American movements, and I think I learned this from you, Giovanni, we've talked about this a couple of times, but the difference between advocacy around issue areas in the United States and movements that are positioned to directly contest for political power, right? Like to contest for the reins of power. And I think that that's an important frame to think about in thinking about electoral politics, not just as a tool, right? We know that it's a tool of harm reduction and survival, and by necessity, because of the structural barriers that exist in the United States that are different than in a place like Bolivia, right? Like they have this oligarchy here in the United States locked down well, right? They've built a wall of structural barriers through law, right? To like basically protect the power that those two parties have. And so not, you know, thinking of electoral politics, not just as a tool, but what would it look like for us to organize towards that as an end game, right? To like really, what would it take for us to build working class power to really take the reins of the political power? So we're not just begging for a political establishment that doesn't care about us, that doesn't serve us, doesn't actually align with our values, but instead being able to position ourselves down the road, aspiring towards this struggle to really be able to take the reins of power so that we are bringing about our agenda, right? And not just asking someone to give us crumbs from an agenda. And that's going to take a long time, right? In my mind. So that's a multi-decade strategy. And I think sometimes that, you know, what I reflect on from learning about these other struggles is like that I think that the US left has suffered for the lack of deep organization, in contrast to mobilization, and also for lack of multi-decade strategy, right? That is about how do we build that collective power. So I'm excited. I think that this is a wild time to be alive, where I think that we're seeing an upsurgence of really amazing political leadership across several important institutions that are really thinking about how do we build that. And how do we build across institutions to unite the poor and unite the working class in ways that other movements have, and in ways that honestly movements even in the United States way back in our history have, right? I think that that's important to remember, is that the framework that we have for political struggle now is not the framework that has always existed. Yeah, so I think that that's a good bridge, Todd. We heard a little bit from our comrades and also from Giovanni laying it out, like what are some of the key power players. So I'm curious to dig a little bit more into kind of why do you think that, you know, we've heard about US meddling and intervention, given your experience being there in a previous coup attempt in, you know, 2008, and then watching this more recent one play out, like why do you think that the US is so involved and so invested in Bolivia, right? Like why? I think most of us don't know the interests that are there.
It's a really good question. It was one that I you know, when I was there, I remember meeting with like the U.S. Embassy and like they're like, look, we're just here to support and be helpful. Like that's all we are. You know, like you know, like you won't get a clear expression from the U.S. state as to why, you know, it might be. You know, maybe when we get like all the documents declassified in 30 years, we'll be able to piece it together. But like, it's hard to tell and it's hard to know. I mean, the best guess is, you know, like, let's keep in mind the legacy, you know, Bolivia is still a post-colony, right? The legacy of colonialism, they've had 500 years of being inserted into the international, you know, economic system as basically just a source of raw materials. First, you know, silver from the mines of Potosi, which enriched the Spanish Empire. But now and more, you know, since the middle of the 20th century, it's a natural gas exporter to Brazil, Argentina, a little bit of Chile. And you know, the gas war that was fought in 2002, like that Sanchez de Lozada, Goni, the president that was forced to flee to the United States. That at that time it was proposed that that the U.S. would buy up, a lot of these natural gas resources, that there would be a port, a liquefied gas port built in Chile to supply gas directly to the United States. So it is very much still tied up in sort of natural resource access. And, there's a lot of controversy over the role of the lithium. Bolivia has the largest single deposit of lithium in the entire world. There is a lot of lithium spread throughout the world, but at the same time, the single, easiest deposit, the cheapest deposit to probably to get lithium from would be the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. And lithium is going to be a big part of solar panels and green and cars and things like that, Tesla. So it's possible that had nothing to do with it. Although there was some, people want to look into it. There could be more. There's a controversy over what the lithium contracts, what role they played with more recently miners, and lithium workers saying, no, it was absolutely core to this coup. So keep in mind, just like that history of if we want cheap access to energy and raw materials, it's in our interest to have friendly, U.S. friendly people in charge, and ones that will not try to industrialize these resources for local benefit, but will just export them to us as raw materials. And the MOS and the social movement goals, the principles that were incorporated into the new constitution that was put in place in 2009, following the MOS victory, was that these are natural resources for indigenous sovereignty, for local benefit, and not for international export. If we're going to export it, we'll do it on favorable terms. So the base economics could be at play. And then there's also the fact that, the U.S. has long sort of viewed South America as sort of, its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine has always considered Central and South America to be ours. No one else should meddle, because that's our place to sort of meddle and have control over, have hegemony over. And groups like the CIA and the School of the Americas have sort of an institutional inertia where, that's their raison d'etre, is to maintain our influence and regional control. And so, those factors could be involved, as well as, Bolivian elites have direct ties to a lot of, they oftentimes their family will have, citizenship or family here in the United States. They'll have influence over, politicians here. Sorry, a comment just popped up and distracted me. And so, so those also sort of like organic ties between the traditional oligarchy in Bolivia, who was never happy about the MOS taking power, and how close they are to a lot of U.S. Politicians, and they're a voting bloc in some states in this country, as part of a regional elite agenda, and the influence they have in the U.S. to say, hey, come help us out. We want to get back in power. We're tired of this. And so there's a lot of multifaceted ways in which there could be a perception of interests. And those are the ones that sort of are probably the most likely. There could be more that, we just won't know about, because a lot of times we rely on leaks or whistleblowers to tell us about what's really going on. So, it may take years, or, I might just take a whistleblower to let us know what the real motivations were. But in terms of the actor, one thing I skipped over was the Organization of American States, which was created during the Cold War is widely understood outside of the U.S., not in the U.S., but in South America and Central America, it's widely understood as a U.S. instrument. You know, it's 60% funded by the U.S. government. Some of its departments are 100% funded by the U.S. government. It is very much considered an apparatus of the U.S. foreign policy and intelligence, machinery. And even though the sitting president of it, Luis Almagro, was put in place by the progressive president of Uruguay, Mujica. As the political winds changed in the United States and Trump came to power, it was probably clear that a new and as well as the political winds on the continent changed with Bolsonaro winning and what some commentators called the ending of the peak tide. That the OAS went from sort of being in the Obama era, like hands off, what we won't get too involved. We'll come in and sort of weigh in as pure technocrats. It seemed like Bolivia, the role they play in the Bolivian coup, as well as some other contemporaneous things, that they were sort of taking on a new role. Mike Pompeo, there was a quote where he very tellingly said, what we're seeing of, at the OAS is a return to the spirit of the OAS in the 50s and the 60s, which was when it was clearly just a Cold War instrument, a partisan of the US capitalist state. So
yeah, one of the things that hearing you out about with the question, tying with the question that Brittany said earlier. Something that Brittany said earlier, one of her in the previous session, her being Candace when she was in the military and for the military, and just had me thinking about mass movements in the streets, and how here in the United States, people are progressive and liberals, left-leaning people, anarchists and stuff like that. They tend to like buy in into a lot of things that they see in the screens, on TV. They see mass mobilization in the streets, and
we have a puppy problem.
Giovanni, you're muted. You have to
Yeah. So seeing people out on the street, they call it people power, etc. Right? But if you look at the who's being shown, for example, in the street, in the screens here, like you see young people, young movements in Bolivia, for example, just like the panelists said earlier, college students. On the street, you assume, they're the good guys, the government's the bad guy. It's always that narrative. You see people on the street, you see young people in the streets in Nicaragua, you see young people in the streets in Venezuela, for example, right? But in countries like Colombia, when there's young people in the streets right now and getting beat up and they're getting tear gas and everything, and they're getting thrown from bridges and whatnot. You see there's people in Chile, when they're losing their eyes by the carabineros, which is the Chilean police, when they're getting beat up in the middle of the street and stuff like that. Those scenes are absent in American media, right wing, left wing, and middle media. Just so happen, that scenes of mass movement in the United States are only worth showing in American media if they are from targeted countries. If they're from friendly countries, you don't see those movements. Just like we're seeing just like this movement right now in Guatemala, and police is just brutally beating down, suppressing people on the street. But you don't see those images. What's your take on that? And that question is to both of you.
Go ahead, Todd. Yeah.
So what I would say is that, it was just going back, even for myself, when, because I admit, as of October last year, 2019, I hadn't been in Bolivia for, almost a decade at that point. And, was busy with life in the US and, hadn't been following it. And so it was, even for me, it was very confusing at first because a lot of what was being said, criticisms of the mosque from further left groups that were being promoted online were not necessarily inaccurate. And, there was definitely a magnification of valid criticisms, and most importantly, presenting them with a complete lack of historical or even current context. But, it wasn't like talking about the Tipneys, which was a highway that was like a mega project through a protected land area. And that, that did happen, and it did split off some of the indigenous support for the mosque. And, he was running for a fourth term, which for a lot of people who really, have an affinity for procedural liberal norms and, and the closeness of the referendum, I think it was a complex situation, but yes, there was a fourth term being, and that was against, the original Constitution. There was, a Supreme Court, ruling saying it was okay. And, it was like 0.1% of the country was very split on whether that was a valid move or not in the 2016 move. But so the criticisms of okay, they've done some things that breach norms, and they've done some things that were not, 100% environmentally accurate or respective of indigenous, of autonomy. Those are true. And I think that, was confusing for a lot of people in the North. But I think that the deeper point is state power in the post-colony is really tied to international structures of power that are not friendly to indigenous people, Afro-Bolivians, campesinos, workers, farmers. And so when you have social movements take power as a means to achieve liberation, it inherently creates some contradictions within those movements. So when you heard voices, saying the mosque had lost support, yeah, that was true. Ruling alienates some people. Like Abraham Lincoln said, you can't please all of the people all of the time. And so I think, that fact was partly why it was so hard for the international left, or even just most of the international community to sort of tell, how to weigh some of these claims. But I think if, people who were closely following it were able to sort of see that a lot of this was you're really exaggerating. You're making something out of do you really think a neoliberal government is going to be better on? It seemed clear that there was an X factor that was involved, and that's where it started to get into concepts of hybrid warfare, which I think you and Brittany could maybe do a better job explaining. But it started to ring some bells for me. But I think setting all that aside, very quickly in November, after the massacres started occurring, it became clear that the real consequences of a regime change strategy was merely to open the door to far-right minority rule and return historically, privileged class of white settler colonials who still identify as Europeans in the Bolivian context, just brought them back to power and Catholic state rule. So I think it very quickly became clear, but in the moment it was hard to sort of tell, especially if you don't have direct access to social movements on the ground telling, the previous panel said, yes, of course they're telling us, but just in the flood of media, sometimes their voices get drowned out by other voices, ones that maybe have more privileged access to Twitter or, the New York Times or something like that. I need 1 second.
Yeah. Okay, no problem. Yeah, I think that's a great bridge. And there's a question in the comments that I want to lift up that I think is a great bridge to wrapping up as we wrap up for our last few minutes together. You know, something that comes to mind, just to break it down for anyone who's like a little lost in the sauce. We've heard a lot, right? We're learning a lot. I'm learning so much. I hope you are too, who are tuned in with us. I just want to pull back a little bit and highlight that there are two major drives, and you could think of them as structures, right? Or like superstructures for that drive US interventionism and exploitation, and they're deeply entangled, right? So it's like difficult even to think of them as really two separate things, but for the sake of understanding it, I think it's important. One is multinational corporate interests, right? So there are several multinational and US-based powerful corporations who have deep interests, as Todd has pointed out and others have pointed out, in exploiting Latin American countries and through Central and South America and around the world for labor, for resources, for the land, right? For all of these different things, for their profit motives and power motives. So that's one of those structures, right? That's really important to understand. Those multinational corporations and national corporations, US-based corporations, have incredible amounts of power to shape the political landscape in the United States. And so that's why I say the second structure that I want to name and uplift is our political structure, right? Our political economy, and our political structure is the drive is geopolitics, right? So we have this particular philosophy that we talk about when we talk about militarism in the United States, that like might is right? And that we have to, that in order for us to be safe, in order for people to be safe and secure, that we have to aggressively and violently project our military power and our economic power around the world and control operations around the world. And that leads to the fact that we have 800 bases around the world. The fact that we are so interested in the, many of the bombing campaigns and things like that, right? Like are about geopolitical positioning. And so when you put those two things together, that is part of why that twin drive is why the United States powers that be are so interested in removing any government in Latin America who wants to block external exploitation in their country and instead make sure that the economy and that the labor of their country is benefiting that country first, and that they have autonomy over how those decisions are getting made, right? That is against those multinational corporate interests, because that means that they can't just have a green light from some puppet government that will say, of course, you can come and exploit our people and our land and our resources, right, however you would like. And so I just wanted to zoom out a little bit for anyone who feels a little bit lost about all of these pieces and just kind of boil those things down, because you've heard a lot of detail about those, and that's kind of like that overarching framework that you can use to understand and think about why the US is getting involved in a lot of places around the world. And so with that, we had a great question in the comments from Jamila, which is that, you know, we just moved out, we're moving out of this openly right-wing fascist authoritarian administration of Trump, right? Which I think was jarring to so many people, not just because of the material effects of the blitz of executive orders and creating new branches of the military, new branches of basically violent police and Gestapo, right? All of these different things that he did, being openly racist and attacking so many marginalized communities. But also, I think it's important not to erase the aggressive expansion of imperial projects, including bombing campaigns, including our wars, despite his kind of claims of, oh, I'm against the military-industrial complex, I'm trying to end the wars, right? What we've seen is actually a lot of moving around, and when you look at the numbers, really an expansion. And yet, we're moving into, you've heard a little bit about neoliberalism, we're moving into a neoliberal administration, which we should be clear is not just not fascist, right? There are components of authoritarianism and fascism that manifest in a neoliberal administration that are just different. They manifest differently, they seem more polite, they seem more gentle, and yet at the end of the day, a bombing campaign that is voiced politely is still a violent bombing campaign, right? And so it's important for us to acknowledge that the Biden administration, Biden's track record has been very obviously, very deeply invested in imperialism and imperial projects. You can see that in his advocacy against against self-determination earlier in his career in trade negotiations and trade policy. You can see that in the way that he helped to whip the votes to make the Iraq War happen, and kind of stood by that even when it became clearer and clearer that that war was based on lies and not the good faith that it was sold to with the American, to the American people. And also in his promise, right? He promised unequivocally in 2014 when I was deployed that we would leave Afghanistan in 2014, no matter what, right? And he made it a point to say, my opponent says that there are conditions that might shape, and not me. I'm saying no matter what, we're going to leave, and yet we're still there, right? And yet in this recent presidential run, he still didn't make a firm commitment to end the so-called war on terror and actually end these forever wars or make any meaningful changes, and that's for a reason. Right? That's not an oversight. That's because based on his track record, he's been heavily invested in interventionism and likely will continue to be. And so with all of that, that was a long run up to the question, but with all of that, I think that context is important as we start to wrap up about takeaways. Jamila's question is, given that, are we concerned basically about the ways that Biden might attack Bolivian peoples? Given this rejection of the coup in the upcoming, in the years we're looking forward for the administration, and what are the things that we in the belly of the beast can be doing to fight against that? And I think that that's a really great question that I would love to hear both of your opinions on. We can go to you first, Todd, but then also, as we're wrapping up, also if there are, 2 to 3 things that you just really want to kind of leave with our audience as key takeaways from this discussion, I invite you to also just kind of really foot stomp those as we're wrapping up together.
Sure. Yeah. It's a great, I totally agree with that. I mean, some of the worst massacres that we just discussed happened under neoliberal governments in Bolivia while neoliberal governments were in charge here in the US, George W. Bush or Obama. So, it's definitely an open question. I definitely don't have the answers. I will say, one of my 2 points that I want to end with, what I heard over and over again when I was in Bolivia is if you want to help us, because I was like, I really, really want to help you. And they're like, if you want to help us, go home to the US and enact change there, because for exactly what you just said, Brittany, like this is something that like maybe is not front and center in the minds of us here, because we're sort of in the belly of the beast and sort of insulated a little bit from and isolated from the consequences of our foreign policy. But to Bolivians, like this is everyday life. Like they can't ignore this, it's common, you're not a college, it's not just college professors who think about this there, right? It's everyone, and like what I was told over and over again is go home and enact change there, because that is one of the major barriers that is preventing us from experimenting and finding, models of liberation, that respect our 5,000 year traditions while also being part of the contemporary world, which and they're very internationalist and see themselves as part of the world in a way that I think is another inspiration. I don't know what that exactly means for us. It's something like this, just education. Education is a great place to start. Talking about it with everyone, I think is important, starting to break down to fill in those historical gaps in knowledge so that people are less susceptible to ahistorical, propaganda, hybrid warfare. And then, I'd actually be really excited to hear what the Chiapas Support Committee, what they would say. So, hopefully more to come there. And just to end, the one thing I do want to end with, the last point, we've touched on how this is, how like I think one of the points that we've been dancing around is how one of the reasons that it was so easy for, groups that in the lead up to, the October 2019 election, there was a lot of splits and some of those are permanent, but like you know, some of the fact that like the coalition didn't sort of show up to stop the coup, you know, there was based on sort of contradictions and splits within the movement over 14 years of governing. But once we moved into November, I mentioned like because of the massacres and the true nature of things sort of, but I think it's because it wasn't just that people were like shocked at the violence of the coup regime and the fascism of some of the, you know, the far right youth groups on the streets. It's also because they themselves have this historical understanding of the MOS was a political tool. It's just one political tool, and you know, people were ready to take it or leave it, but it was a political tool for, you know, the 500-year struggle against colonialism and settler colonialism, and the liberation. I'll just, you know, one of the groups, one of the newspapers, there's a great quote that I just want to end with real quick. You know, one of the indigenous radical newspaper or, you know, magazines, political opinion magazines had a, you know, it was interesting. I'm going to read something that they wrote in 2007, 2008, which was the last the far right uprising that Giovanni mentioned that I was there for. They had actually, you know, they were very unsympathetic to the MOS in October, and then I think quickly changed. And there's a parallel, you know, if you go back, this is December 2000. They said, you know, if this government falls, the process of liberation will be frustrated, you know, and they said, you know, they gave advice to other indigenous, speaking as indigenous, we must distinguish between the principal enemy, the right wing and colonialism, and the secondary enemy, this lukewarm government, which is more or less aligned with our interests. And sort of the ability to take strategic and contingent and sort of like, you know, non-set in stone decisions like that, and say like, look, we have our criticisms of any group that's going to take state power. They're obviously, and we're going to have this negotiation, but we need to keep in mind here and the true nature of the struggle. And I think that provided a lot of clarity. That's something that I heard over and over again, you know, living in the country. And it's just something to keep in mind, and maybe another thing for us to keep in mind too, you know.
Yeah, I want to add to some of the things that both of you have been saying. I know that Brittany painted a big picture of bombings and everything, you know, from neoliberals, from conservatives, right? The same thing. You know, people being bombed does not make the distinction if it's being bombed by a grotesque man or a polite man. You know, it's being bombed regardless, right? But another way the war is propagated is other ways, like Todd mentioned earlier, hybrid warfare in the sense of sanctions. In the sense of sanctions, it often kill as many as it would a bombing raid would, just slowly, because it denies people a lot of vital, you know, goods and needs and so forth. You know, right now, the United States is sanctioning pretty much a quarter of the world. You know, and there's countries being excessively sanctioned. One of them is being Venezuela. The other one is Iran. You know, so keep that in mind, that warfare is not only bombing and boots on the ground. You know, there's other methods of warfare, which is siege warfare, which that's what sanctioning is. Also, Brittany talked about neoliberalism, right? What does that mean? That means, you know, rough an explanation. Neoliberalism is when capital just roam free, you know, unrestricted. You know, corporations and companies have free reign, you know, and the state's only obligation is social control, you know. So that's what was happening in a lot of these countries in South America, and Bolivia. Just give a recent example, which is as soon as the Janine government took power, you know, they just, you know, open up the country, you know, to get looted, you know, for capital to roam free, leave out of the country, whereas the opposite was happening under Morales. But yeah, so closing on this conversation, great conversation. Hopefully, we have more of these conversations, more analysis. Is if there's something that we can do immediately, as you know, I know no one has the answers, but something that you can think of that we can immediately do here in the Belly of the Beast. What would that be? Just just that one thing.
One other thing, again, I don't know. I mean, but one thing I heard that did make a lot of sense to me. I was listening to a panel of sort of similar to this, where it was people that had been involved in, I think, El Salvador since the 80s. And what they, very pessimistic, which I think makes sense given the experience of, El Salvador. One thing you heard a lot about South Americans say about Central America is they say, tan lejos de Dios, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. Like the pity of Central America is it's so far from God, but so close to the United States. Setting that aside, what they said is if we could just get one national elected official with a major platform to start talking about the reality on the ground and communicating that can serve a really powerful educational role. So that might be one place to start.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Giovanni. There was another comment from a viewer, Jorge, that as long as the valuable things, the land, the resources, et cetera, that exist in Latin America are there, and imperialist forces will do their meddling and do their violence. And I think that that's right. And so when I think about what is it going to take to overcome that, I just want to make a plug that I think that we get, there's just there for good reason. This is a self-critique in some ways, that like here in the US left, it's just so difficult not to get distracted with all of the things that we have to react to, because it's difficult because you're making decisions as you go about like, how can I just not do something about this, right? Or how can I just not try to stop this horrible thing that's going to happen and do something? And and we shouldn't. We should try to react and respond and do what we can to minimize harm. And yet, I just really want to make a plug that when we think about the problem, right, if we understand the problem as this structure that is built around this political economy, right, that is basically built around corporate interests and the interests of a few and the interests of wealthy, and they control actually our political arena, then that brings us to the question of like, I'm interested in the roots, right? Like, what is it going to take to undo all of that? And I think one answer to that is we really have to learn from Latin American struggle, actually, and we have to really commit to uniting the class and doing the difficult work of organizing, right? And organizing as different from mobilizing, but building organization that can hold our broad agenda, as opposed to fight for individual crumbs that we're trying to get as concessions from a power structure that still isn't ours, right? It's not for us, it's not by us. And so I really just want to encourage folks that, I learned a lot from this election season, the debates I had with people, the arguments, the disagreements, all of these things, I really learned a lot. And it's gotten clear to me that in the United States, like, we don't differentiate enough between political analysis and strategic analysis. And those are not the same thing, right? We can have an alignment of an ideological or political analysis, which says that these are the things that we're facing, right? These are the forces, these are the way that those systems of power and oppression operate in our present. This is how they got here, right? In terms of the historical component of that. And yet, those things are necessary in order for us to develop a strong strategic analysis, but those things inherently don't actually tell us what we can do about that, right? Me agreeing that this is ultimately the United States is an imperial settler colonial state, right? That it's been that since its founding in that it was founded on top of and without the consent of indigenous nations that were already here and has continued to project that project of colonialism around the world, we can agree on that, right? And so often when we're having these discussions about what is it going to take for us to overcome that, people keep coming back to ideology, right? Back to politics, like, but this, but it's illegitimate, right? And it's like, no, we agree, right? Like we can get to the place of agreement. And I think we weren't always there, right? But I think we're building that. We're building more of that on the left in the United States. And so, I just want to challenge all of us to remember that we also have to then take the next step and ask, so what does that require of us, right? Given our analysis and our assessment of the political conditions that we're working in, the economic and other material conditions, what does that tell us about what is it? How do we actually get, if we believe a revolution is necessary, how do we get from where we are right now to not just revolutionary conditions, but to be prepared to win in those revolutionary conditions, because those are also not the same thing, right? You can bring about revolutionary conditions and then you can have a failed state military dictatorship, as we've seen in many of the US's interventions, right? Where you topple a government and then there's a puppet government or a military dictatorship that is ushered in, often with our support in the aftermath. So that would be my answer. And I know that that's unsatisfying because we all want something that we can do immediately. And of course, there are those things. I just shared the link again. The link to the Chiapas Support Committee is in the comments. For all of you who have been tuned in, please check them out. Please continue supporting their work and see if there are ways that you can get involved with them and building solidarity relationships. And making sure that we're doing our work. The other thing we can immediately do is think about the ways that we can do our work here in a way that is internationalist, right? There's not enough of that. And if we understand this, the system, global capitalism and corporatism that we're up against is international. And so our opposition to that is going to require international organizing. And so, just an invitation and encourage everybody to continue every day thinking about how you can be stepping into that as we build organization here in the United States. And then last, I think that shift around moving through ideological analysis, which is important, and then into that strategic analysis, because we need to have more debates about that. There's not even enough of the initial thinking about it that we're having robust conversations about it, because they often also, get caught up in the ideology as opposed to the strategy. And I personally am hungry, right? I'm not here to organize as some kind of hobby. When I realized that I had participated in empire, I dedicated my life to doing whatever I could to undo it. And I'm interested in organizing in a way that expects to win, even if it's winning beyond my lifetime. And so that if we are committed to revolutionary struggle, then it's inherent. It's important that we be asking ourselves, what will it take over the course of several decades for us to actually win? So without any further ado, Giovanni, Todd, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up this 2-hour action-packed, knowledge-packed session that we've had?
I just want to say thank you guys for joining us. About face DemilitarizeU. This is our first session, our first live stream. Hopefully we'll do more. I just want to echo what Brendan said. We got to be internationalists. Internationalist means understanding the United States is not an island, that there's more people around the world. And two, we need to have solidarity. Solidarity requires action, not just good feelings. And with that, let's close this show down.
All right. Take good care, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. And please remember to share so that others can continue to be learning alongside us as well.